Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Committee on Security of America's Medical Product Supply Chain. This is day one of our public workshop, and we're happy to have you here. I'd like to thank HHS and ASPR for sponsoring the study of which this workshop is part, and to thank all of our speakers and panelists for joining us in this important day. So I have a little disclaimer to read before we actually dig down into the work of the workshop. And so first I'd like to note that this is an open, on-the-record information gathering session. The committee is still in the process of assembling materials that it will examine and discuss in the course of making its findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Therefore, I ask everyone here to be extremely mindful of this fact and that we have made no conclusions, and it would be a mistake for anyone to conclude that otherwise. Comments made by individuals, including the members of the committee, should not be interpreted as positions of the committee or of the academies. For those of you who are not familiar with this committee process, this is the second of 5 planned committee meetings. Some of these, including today, will include public sessions where we'll have opportunity to hear from experts in the field and to receive public testimony. The committee will deliberate thoroughly before writing its draft report. Once that report is drafted, it must go through a rigorous review by experts who are anonymous to the committee, and then the committee must respond to that review with appropriate revisions that satisfy the Academy's Report Review Committee and the chair of the National Research Council, NRC, before it becomes an NRC report. The expected report release date is in the first quarter of 2022, and you can get further information on the study, including future meetings, on the project website. Okay, the task with which we've been charged in this study is 1, to assess and evaluate the dependence of the US, including the private commercial sector, the states, and the federal government on critical drugs and devices that are sourced or manufactured outside the US. And 2, to provide recommendations to improve the resilience of the supply chain for critical drugs and devices and address supply vulnerabilities or potential disruptions of such products that would significantly affect or pose a threat to public health security or to national security. So today, we're going to focus on the key considerations for the formulation of a unified list of critical medical products as it relates to our study, and the committee will hear from groups who have already developed such lists. Tomorrow, the committee will hear from other experts about practical approaches for executing a framework for critical medical products, and we'll also hear from on-the-ground perspectives of end users of the medical supply chain. And all those inputs will go into scoping and prioritizing the focus of our study. Our speakers are eminent individuals with long lists of accomplishments. I'd love to give them very laudatory introductions, but to maximize the time we have to hear from them, I'm going to limit my introductions to simply name, title, and affiliation. Once they've spoken for a brief amount of time, 5 minutes each, we will have a Q&A session, and in that session, the committee questions and comments will take priority. And I ask the speakers to try to stay within your allotted time. We will gently provide warnings for you when your time is approaching. So with that, let's move to the first session, which is entitled Key Considerations for Establishing a Framework for Critical Medical Products. And so I'm going to call on each speaker in turn, introduce you, give you 5 minutes, and then we'll go on to the next speaker. And once we're through with all the speakers, we will then move into the Q&A session. Okay? So our first speaker is Stephen SCHONDELMEYER from the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy from the University of Minnesota. Steve, are you ready to go?
Well, let's try it. I have been dropping in and out, and I apologize. I'll be back if I do drop out. I'm glad to be with you and talk about the topic of the drug supply and how we make a secure drug supply for America and for the citizens and patients that we take care of. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota and have been involved with developing a resilient drug supply project, or essentially we're mapping this drug supply chain. And Ben, if you go to the next slide. with our team since 2018, long before COVID-19 hit. We've been developing a drug supply chain map in the U.S. And we identified critical acute drugs, and I'll talk about that in a later about the current drug list. We've also identified critical chronic drugs, talk about why, all the way from the active pharmaceutical ingredient or API to the patient, and even preceding the API with key starting materials. We're looking for ways to assess the root cause of each drug shortage that's been known to exist, both from FDA and American Society of Health System Pharmacists. We're looking to establish a drug supply and shortage tracking framework or a map for every drug product in the US marketplace. And then once we've established that, we'll look for ways to predict and identify where shortages might occur. And we'll talk about that. We're particularly concerned about shortages being driven by both demand surges as well as by supply disruptions. And if you go to the next slide, Ben, we've mapped out the drug product supply chain from even pre-API all the way to the patient. Obviously, the patient is where demand surges come from. If patients have illnesses or problems and an increasing presence of a problem like the pandemic with COVID-19, we've had a dramatic increase in the number of patients with this illness. It's created a demand surge. So we talked through this a slide in the supply chain, and it's really both ends, the patient demand as well as the starting points that can create supply disruptions. And next slide, Ben. Actually, at the bottom, I put some key questions we need to ask ourselves, even when we look at a supply chain. Who is the manufacturer on this slide? The person that made the API, the person that made the drug formulation, the one that made the finished dosage form, the one that is the sponsor with the FDA to get it in the US market, the one that packages it or labels it. We call all of those manufacturer in a general sense, but who is the manufacturer? Second thing, where is the country of origin? Do we pin that to the labeler, the packager, the finished dosage form, the API? The country of origin is an open-ended question. And then what happens if API is not available in a given marketplace? If we don't have API at all, the rest of the supply chain simply does not work. And there is increasingly a concentration of where API is made in the world, and it's concentrated in a few manufacturers and in certain geographic locations and with certain specific types of producers. Next slide, please. I don't want to belabor this, we'll make the slides available, but this shows some drugs. The first column on the left says China, and 50% or more of the world's supply and the US's supply of these drugs comes from China alone. Drugs like acetaminophen is almost all coming from China, and these are all greater than 50% from China. The middle column is drugs with greater than 50% of their supply from Asia, which would include China and India and countries like Singapore and Taiwan and Japan and others. And then the third column is drugs with greater than 50% of the supply coming from foreign sources into the US. And that's a large number of drugs out there. If you go to the next slide, and this is my final slide. This slide, the red bars show you, the red bars show you the foreign dependence on Asia. In other words, the percentage of each of these antibiotics that comes from Asia is the red bar. And notice it's greater than 75% for 19 of the 21 antibiotics that were named as critical antibiotics that might be used to treat secondary infections in COVID-19 patients. The blue bar shows the percentage of the US supply of these antibiotics that's from foreign sources. And there we see foreign sources, 19 of 21 are from foreign sources, 14 of 21 have greater than 50% from Asian sources. So you can see we're heavily dependent on antibiotics for foreign sources, and these are related to COVID-19. Let me close by reminding us that shortages are important, not just because of COVID-19, and we'll talk a lot about COVID-19 issues today, but drug shortages have been with us for 2 or more decades in the US, and serious drug shortages. And drug shortages, that means that physicians and pharmacists and nurses don't have the drugs to treat the patients that are sitting in front of them, and patients get worse medically and may even suffer dramatically or experience death. So drug shortages are a long-standing problem. They existed before COVID-19. They will exist after COVID-19, but COVID-19 has kind of been the perfect storm to highlight for and show us what can happen if our system is stretched in various ways. And we have seen increased demand from COVID-19, but we've also seen decreased supply and serious disruptions of supply channels. So COVID-19 has highlighted shortages and the problems with them, but drug shortages have been with us. We need to work toward a future, though, where we don't make the assumption that drug shortages will always be there. We should have a drug supply in America where drugs are available when they're needed. And we don't have to say, I'm sorry, we don't have that today because it's on back order. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that overview. We'll be back with questions, I'm sure. But before we do that, I want to move on to our next speaker, who is Katera Kalija, who is President and CEO of the Healthcare Supply Chain Association. Katera, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman Hupp and members of the committee. I'm President and CEO of the Healthcare Supply Chain, and I want to thank the committee for holding this workshop on this critically important topic and the opportunity to share our perspective today. HSCA and our member companies particularly appreciate the work of the committee and its focus on national security and public health preparedness to respond to COVID-19 and future challenges to increase supply chain resiliency. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about group purchasing organizations, our unique line of sight over the healthcare supply chain, and how we support providers and the patients they serve. We are the sourcing and purchasing partners to America's healthcare providers, including hospitals, long-term care facilities, clinics, surgery centers, and others. We help our provider partners to support a safe and reliable supply of products. Healthcare crises like the coronavirus have placed enormous stress on hospitals, other healthcare providers, and the communities they serve. We play a critical role in supporting emergency response and public health efforts, and we're deeply committed to ensuring that healthcare providers are prepared to respond to such challenges. We have taken a number of innovative steps to support the response to COVID-19, including supply chain coordination efforts to help medical teams obtain critical products, adding manufacturers to contracts to rapidly increase the supplies, and working with non-traditional and adjacent industries to fill supply gaps for essential products such as hand sanitizer, isolation gowns, and surgical caps. We are committed to increasing competition and bringing new domestic suppliers to market to ensure continued access to essential medicines and products. HSCA members have launched partnerships with manufacturers to increase the supply of essential medical products, which have proved to be critical during the pandemic. For example, following a demand spike of nearly 300% for propofol in March and April, one member's program was able to bring an additional 676,000 units to frontline workers needed for ventilator care. Another HSCA member enabled access to more than 150 drugs designated as shortage drugs and successfully protected supply chain, even as demand surged during the pandemic. In another example, an HSCA member leveraged its relationship with a domestic textile manufacturer to assist in converting manufacturing lines to create more than 2 million reusable isolation gowns and 700,000 surgical masks and face shields. We are leaders in quality assurance, and we take a comprehensive approach that considers not only the competitive and value of the product, but also the quality of manufacturing, the reliability, and the stability of supply, as well as key FDA inspections and current good manufacturing practices. Our fierce commitment to quality helped to protect member hospitals from purchasing counterfeit or inferior goods during this COVID pandemic. Our members worked around the clock to field thousands of inquiries and vet new manufacturers for compliance with federal standards and ensure safeguards for product quality. We have long advocated for measures to support supply chain resiliency. This pandemic has underscored this issue. Patients and providers rely on consistent access to critical medical product, and shortages of these products could have devastating consequences. We have several recommendations which I'm pleased to share with you today. First off, we applaud FDA's efforts to compile and release a list of essential medicines, devices, and products and their critical inputs required for patient care in urgent situations. This is a great step forward. And we encourage the agency to consider expanding this list, taking into consideration additional factors such as site of care affected populations, clinical circumstance, number of available alternatives, shortage vulnerability, and more. As the U.S. continues to address the pandemic, strengthening the healthcare supply chain is more important than ever. Specifically, we must increase the resilience of the supply chain through enhanced visibility, redundancy, and diversification. In order to strengthen this resiliency, FDA and the private sector must have visibility into the source, location, and volume of manufacturing for both raw materials and finished products. Access to this information will enable FDA and the private sector to plan for and identify potential shortages, consider backup supply, and work to take measures to help mitigate shortages. We must understand these vulnerabilities and take systematic steps to protect the supply chain well before emergencies occur. Without this information, stakeholders are unable to ensure redundancy, leaving the supply chain vulnerable to shortages if production is disrupted. The good news is manufacturers have become increasingly willing to share this information with our member companies as part of partnerships that I mentioned earlier, which has helped our provider partners plan for and avoid and mitigated shortages. However, access to this information is far from universal nor assured and varies depending on the individual manufacturer, the agreements or partnerships achieved, and the products involved. Our industry supports measures like those included in the CARES Act, which strengthen reporting requirements for manufacturers, including certain information about active pharmaceutical ingredients and other raw materials. And we believe policymakers should further build upon these provisions. We have long hailed competition as a solution to increase availability and reduce cost, but competition also helps to advance redundancy by ensuring there are multiple manufacturers helping to prevent disruptions and to be nimble when events necessitate it. Supply chain diversification is essential for supply chain resiliency, helping to avoid over-reliance on any particular region. The global nature of the supply chain should be leveraged to build in redundancies, shoring up domestic manufacturing, as well as sourcing in various geographic locations to help prevent supply disruptions for raw materials or finished products, and our ability to scale up as needed. To increase domestic manufacturing, policymakers should explore positive incentives such as tax incentives or loans, flexibility in regulatory processes, and in infrastructure investment, as well as explore opportunities for technological advances such as advanced manufacturing to support production of quality medicines and the raw materials critical to U.S. patient care. In closing, I want to thank the committee for allowing us to provide our perspective and recommendations, and I look forward to continuing to be a resource to you. Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much, Khalija. Katera, we'll be back to you. We kind of went out of order a little bit, but Nathaniel, you are here now. So Nathaniel HUPERT is the co-director of the Cornell Institute for Disease and Disaster Preparedness at the Weill Medical College of Cornell University.
Here's the big picture. When we're talking about critical supply and use, especially of these medical countermeasures and other critical items for medical care, the picture that needs to be recalled is really the complexity of the system. So this is a simplification showing 5 interdependent systems in a disaster preparedness architecture, going all the way from management systems through the system and process design, and of course with vaccines, this is manufacturing of vaccines and decisions about availability, through justification, funding, and promotion. As we know now, of course, the justification of the use of these critical measures is sometimes more important even than their manufacture, and through to logistics and fixed infrastructure. The most important conceptual framework that I'd like to convey is that these systems need to be seen in an interdependent way. And really, we have examples from past moments in time with pandemics, for example, where, for example, with the antiviral distribution during the H1N1 pandemic, we had lesions in this system in terms of visibility of where the antivirals went and how they were used. And so if I just go ahead, using that framework that I showed before, you can see that different parts of this distribution system involve different components of those 5 interdependent systems that make up this architecture. And there are 2 sort of highways of information that need to be essentially seamless for this activity to happen in a way that achieves the aims that we're hoping for. One is that information needs to be flowing up and back across these various sites. So all the way from the point of use, which can also be called the point of dispensing, back up to the regional or state leaders who are managing the distribution of these assets, to US central distribution sites, which can be single or multiple, and then up to the suppliers. In this case, vaccine, because that's obviously in the news, but it could be suppliers of other items. At the same time, the business processes that keep track of the use and the demand and the supply of these items needs to be going in parallel. And this is all happening in time. And the decision systems, of course, are critically impacted by not only the lead times of, for example, when I'm working at my hospital in downtown Manhattan and we run out of remdesivir, the question is how long does it take for that to get first in my own hospital system back up to those who can supply it, and then from the hospital system back to the suppliers at a more geographic scale. What we're looking at in the next month and probably going out through the next several years is the application of that sort of system to this, which is a obviously very simplified framework for how the vaccine will be distributed according to rules that are being laid down right now. And the planning considerations are new and immense. So for example, as everyone knows, the Pfizer vaccine, for example, requiring negative 40 degrees centigrade or lower, with units that can only be opened twice a day, with upwards of 900 vials or unit doses within each container, versus other vaccines with other. So the logistical requirements and the cold chain are truly something that will need to be, that will challenge everyone along the way. And the other question that of course is really important is this notion of reverse logistics and transshipments, getting back to the idea of risk pooling. And now this has not received a lot of attention, but risk pooling, according to my engineering colleagues, is absolutely essential to not getting us into a situation where either demand is not met or demand is met, but we run out because we've oversupplied early on. There are other issues having to do with booster shots and then population profiles and priorities, but fundamentally, when we get the architecture right and we understand the various actors, these are the 5 supply chain fundamentals. And these are really from my colleague, Jack Muckstadt, who many in the engineering world know well from his decades as a teacher, but also as an author of several textbooks on supply chain fundamentals. It comes down to very straightforward information. Knowing your customer requirements. In this vaccine context, it's what is the demand for the vaccine? And that's, of course, a very difficult to parse now, a kind of sociological issue. Who's going to ask for it, and how important is it going to be for them if they can't get it? And then constructing these supply chain organizations, which are being built on the fly right now, on top of very well practiced state and local standard vaccine infrastructures. The next thing is the information infrastructure, and then the business processes, as I mentioned, those two arrows that will be both intra-organizational and extra-organizational, interfacing with entities that perhaps aren't normally part of this supply chain system for vaccines. And then finally, capping it all off, decision support systems to figure out what to do when things don't work the way we expect. We have these very effective systems in place. For example, the VTRAC system. It provides a tremendous number of functions and can handle inventory and distribution. So I'm not saying that we need to build these things from scratch, but one thing that any supply chain engineer will be able to tell you is that there are very interesting features of an uncertain demand system. And so this is a great recent paper from 2008, just showing how some of these things that are called the bullwhip effect, when you get ripples in the effort to fulfill demand, and the reverse bullwhip effect, which is efforts to keep demand constant, but with variation efforts to keep supply constant, but with variations in demand. Part of the problem with COVID-19 and the whole vaccine question is we don't really know what the demand is going to be like. And we can create scenarios where demand is going to be very high or it's going to be very low, depending on the location, the occupation, and in fact, simply the milieu of where people are. We've created a distribution model. We, as I'm sure, probably every engineering department in the country has their own vaccine distribution model. It's got many features that I don't have time to go into right now, but its outputs, I think, are very critically important and very practical. Planned deliveries showing allocations, recommended allocation on day one versus later days, expected shortfalls, et cetera. And this is an example where, say, California has a back order, but this is the type of functionality that I think we certainly need at a national level and probably down at a subnational level. And this is the type of input that supply chain engineering can provide for this particular critical issue for COVID response. I think that's all I'll say right now, and I'd be happy to answer questions later. So I apologize for the technical problems, but appreciate the time. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Nathaniel, and thank you for working out those technical glitches. We appreciate the overview. All right, we're going to move on next to James Lawler, who is Director of Clinical and Biodefense Research at the Strategic National Research Institute at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. James, are you ready to go? Yep, there you are. There you are. Okay.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks everyone, and appreciate the ability to speak to everyone today. I'm not going to present any slides or be nearly as technical as my colleague Nathaniel there, but I do think a couple of things are critical to point out, and I think that in the discussions that we've had already, it's evident that this is a critical vulnerability that we have, both from a national security perspective, but also from a day-to-day healthcare provision perspective. I'm practicing infectious disease
distinctive in that it's not a
medical center, and when I'm on service, it is almost a weekly occurrence for our pharmacy to send out a notification about antibiotic shortages that we have because of supply chain interruptions for a variety of reasons. And almost continuously, we are juggling some aspect of antibiotic supply chain issue that directly impacts our clinical practice. And that's, again, on a day-to-day basis. And that's gotten much worse over the past 10 years or so, at least in my practicing experience. And while for the most part, we have alternatives that are available and that we can resort to, on occasion, it does present significant problems. And I think as we've seen over the course of the last 10 to 20 years, our issues with antibiotic resistant organisms have continued to increase. And as has been noted in many different fora, our national production of novel antibiotic molecules and classes has continued to decline. And so that mismatch has become even more problematic over the last several years. And these supply chain issues have compounded that. And then I think you just need to look at our current situation and the vulnerabilities that have been pointed out by our supply chain dependency on foreign influence that really create potentially a nightmare scenario. Fortunately, that has not necessarily played out from a supply chain issue here, although I think it will be interesting to see how vaccine distribution is affected not only in the U.S. but in other countries where potentially sovereignty issues around vaccine manufacturing and distribution across international borders can still be a problem. But in future pandemic events or emerging infectious disease outbreaks where there may be more profound shortages of these types of medical countermeasures, those issues of national sovereignty and sharing across international borders puts us in a precarious position, particularly if we are dependent on one geographic region and in particular one country, essentially China, for the majority of some of the APIs that go into many of our products. It creates a national security vulnerability where we are subject to undue influence by these foreign entities that may create significant challenges for us in how we are able to navigate multilateral agreements and international action to take collective action in either containing outbreaks where they originate or taking other necessary actions to potentially close borders. All of that becomes influenced by the international implications and aspects of our vulnerability for supply chain. So I just think that this is something that both from a day-to-day practice and also from an emerging infectious disease outbreak perspective, we need to highlight more clearly to policymakers. I can say that certainly in my time working in the National Security Council and Homeland Security Council, this was still not a problem that was widely recognized by policymakers. I'm not sure that with all of the different aspects of vaccine manufacturing and other therapeutic development and distribution issues that have been encountered in the COVID pandemic, I'm not sure whether those policymakers have still had that supply chain vulnerability highlighted well enough to them. And this is going to be something that we're going to need to take action on. And ultimately, it's up to us to influence those policymakers to understand the problem and to take specific actions to try and prevent that from happening in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, James. Couldn't agree with you more. That's exactly our goal, is to influence policymakers and give them information with which to act. So, all right. Well, last but definitely not least, we have Chris Liu from who is the director of the Department of Enterprise Services for Washington State. Chris.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Lee. I'm the director for Washington State Department of Enterprise Services. During the pandemic, DES has been the principal purchasing agent for the state emergency operation efforts in an effort to backstop our state hospitals and care facilities, of which there are more than 50,000 entities to consider. Our state's procurement role was not to supplant hospitals and suppliers, but to augment and backstop shortages in the system wherever possible. Here are 4 things that we learned. The first thing we learned was get organized, create the infrastructure for information, data, decision-making, and operations on an enterprise scale. Organize the infrastructure in layers and reporting structures and communication channels. This applies to both public and private organizations, associations, and other representative groups. I think Nathaniel spoke to this quite elegantly in his chart. Define the roles that each party plays along with the decision-making structure in which they're allowed to make decisions. The third thing, and this is to identify your subject matter experts and the people you're going to turn to when you don't know something about something that comes up. The next thing is to build bridges between the silos, have a neutral party who can move between groups to help present differing points of view or can organize safe meetings for these groups. The State Emergency Operations Center for the state of Washington has been really the focal point of all these activities because they're set up to do all the things that I've mentioned. And the last thing under getting organized is to understand the quality of the information or data that you're receiving. All the information or data you receive is not equal, and not all data or information should be acted upon. The second lesson we learned is to have a common language. Create and agree on the terminology and definitions. This is insurance that everyone is on the same page when reporting and discussing issues, and it helps avoid confusion. Case in point is in hospitals, the term conservation mode for PPEs means a different thing for every hospital you go to. So we want to make sure that we have that common language when we talk about issues. The third important thing, and I cannot stress this enough, is to build a model and apply it to purchasing, logistics, and the supply chain. The model will allow you to create targets or goals in rough order of magnitude. It allows organizations to become more agile and nimble as they understand the target numbers and how the numbers are composed. A faster recognition of the work involved when adding or subtracting demographic groups leads to quicker decisions. The fourth thing that we learned in this pandemic was communicate often and constantly. If you're in agile organizations, you're very familiar with the stand-up huddles. We have daily standing meetings or huddles that speak to the tactical, but really our strategic meetings that we have daily. The information that we get changes every 24 hours, if not less than that. The daily meeting is where the rubber actually meets the road. And within these groups, empower the smaller groups to make certain types of decisions to free the system to focus on more strategic decisions. Those are the four things that we learned in the state of Washington. They have all kinds of ramifications, I'm sure. I think Nathaniel articulated that in a much more elegant way than my kind of sort of crude way of talking about how the state of Washington has faced the pandemic. But I think it's illustrative of what went on in every single state across the nation. And I think the one thing that I think we would have wished for in this pandemic is better national leadership. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. Back to you.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you all of our speakers. So we're going to shift into Q&A. So I invite my fellow committee members to turn their cameras back on so that the speakers can see who's asking them questions. And while we wait for that to get set up, maybe I can kick us off with a question here. So one of the things that we talk about inside of our committee is the danger of trying to boil the ocean, right? When we start talking about building in resilience, the medical supply chain is so vast and so diversified that we could work forever, trying to make it more reliable, more effective in the face of emergencies. So we need to prioritize. And I heard from the five of you a couple of things. One is that you prioritize by sort of what's essential from a medical standpoint, what do patients need. And the other is you're prioritizing by risk, what's vulnerable in the supply chain. I guess I'd like to go a little deeper than that. What do you think really constitutes a high priority for remediation in a resiliency sense? Where do you focus in your own organizations, or how do you think about it in terms of a framework? So anybody on the first five speakers there that has a perspective on how you think about criticality?
Let me jump in. This is Steve SCHONDELMEYER, and I'm working on getting my video back active again. It's not right now. We focus on criticality as identifying drugs that can affect patients seriously in terms of either serious harm or death that's imminent would be one aspect of criticality. And if you don't have the drug, at least for acute drugs, within minutes to hours, that the patient would experience severe harm. Although we will make the case later in the current list discussion that there's also a need to address chronic medications in urgency. There are chronic medications that a patient may be able to go without for a day or a few days, but if you don't get them on a regular chronic basis, for example, insulin for a diabetic patient, an insulin-dependent diabetic who has no insulin, it won't happen in minutes to hours, but in days to weeks, that patient will seriously progress in their disease, end up in the emergency room, and can experience death even if they don't get the insulin in a timely manner. So criticality, I think, there's the acute side, but there's also a chronic side to criticality.
I would just echo Dr. SCHONDELMEYER's remarks around not only the acute care, but really looking beyond acute care to chronic care, as well as non-acute settings for vulnerable populations, and making sure we don't miss some of those subpopulations for which it's life-saving as well, that we might not inherently jump off the page as we try to get for the greater good. So I do agree there could be some expansions. The list rate that conversations often go to emergency situations, but making sure we're thinking about that life-saving in the context of those populations too becomes critical.
Okay. I'm just looking to my committee here to see if others have questions, because okay.
I've got a hand up.
You do? Okay. Oh, there it is. Great. Yep. I'm sorry. I was scrolled down. I apologize.
It's fine.
Sorry.
It's fine. Well, and this is not the greatest, most incisive question, but Chris, I really appreciated you're what I identify with, which is sort of a knuckle dragger who tries to make sure that things get done. And James, it's so good to see you again. And I know you're out there at the far end of this, as opposed to sort of at the fountain of knowledge that you once occupied on the other end of that. But for both of you, it's sort of a question of, a national plan. And, relatively briefly, Chris and then James, what would be the most helpful component to a national plan to facilitate what it is you are trying to do to meet shortages?
From my standpoint, it's critical that you start really at the very beginning, and that's with leadership. I think we need to have leadership and to have an organization actually help bring us together and to talk about these things. This is a great group to begin that leadership. It's what problem are we really trying to solve over here? And if you can get that national leadership and that national organization to bring all the right entities together, then you've got a really great start. You can move from a national picture to setting up tables and focus groups to center in to certain specific things that you may want to cure. And if you can apply a problem-solving routine, a common problem-solving routine to every one of those tables, then I think you'll get a faster result. And understanding that things don't move in a linear fashion. Everything that we do can move in parallel fashion. So we can come up with solutions pretty darn quickly. The implementation part is where we always get hung up on, is how do we then mobilize all the resources that we need to actually address the problems that we come, or the solutions that we actually come up with. Hopefully they'll all address root cause.
Yeah, Craig, great question. The short term is a more difficult answer, right? Because the ecosystem of pharmaceutical supply chain has evolved over decades now, and it's not something that we're going to fix quickly. I think we lucked out in some ways, to be honest, with COVID, that we're not more dependent on some of these really fragile and critical supply chains that involve international partners. So that is a good thing, although there's still some issues obviously around PPE. Certainly is one area where that's still been a critical vulnerability, and the flood of counterfeit and substandard products is still a pretty significant challenge for health systems. I think in the long term, this is obviously going to require concerted national action. It's going to require legislative action to secure a strategic industrial base for pharmaceutical supplies, particularly those that have a health security implication. It's similar to what has been done for the defense industrial base, in looking at that as a national security asset. I know that the ASPR has been holding some information sessions and looking at that issue over the last couple of years, and even stretching back to when you were ASPR, Craig. I know that those were issues that were explored and investigated. I think perhaps now the significant economic and social damage that's been wrought by the pandemic may create enough momentum to be able to get purchase on the Hill, right? It's always hard to get lawmakers to focus on an issue like this unless it is, politically an important issue, which now, unfortunately, it is. So I think, we potentially have an opportunity because of the pandemic to take advantage of that and use it to craft some legislation that will help to, over time, fix that problems. But it's going to require, I think, a series of carrots and sticks, probably more carrots, to be honest, to provide economic incentives and tax incentives and other things like that to have, to shape the market forces that have created the gap that we're addressing now. And that's going to take years to fix.
Well, as you know, selling health as a national security matter has always been a bit of a challenge with the Hill. And Chris's notion of an enterprise-wide solution is something you and I relate to a lot, because that's sort of what we've tried to create when we had our opportunity in those chairs. But thank you, Chris. Enterprise solution, communication down to the lowest level. And I think thinking about health as a national security matter and really focusing people's attention on that are the two things I heard from you two guys. And thank you.
Yeah, if I might add just one last thing, is if you take a look at our current inventory of statutory tools that are available to us, we actually have a lot of those tools already in existence. And if we were to choose to use those tools, then we would have the starting of an enterprise-wide solution. I'd like to point out that the Defense Production Act under Title III gives us a lot of leeway to encourage and stimulate businesses to manufacture here in the United States. So that's just a beginning. So a current inventory of tools that we currently have available.
Necessarily thinking about it the way you do,
This is Steve Schoendelmeyer. I wanted to comment on a couple of issues I see both with the supply chain and how we get drugs distributed along that supply chain. I think there's an issue of the middle works well, but the beginning and the end don't work well. And let me illustrate what I mean. In terms of the middle working well, when a manufacturer imports drug into the US and then sells it to wholesalers, and that goes through GPOs and through hospital institutional systems, that system works very well for the most part. And they have kept us afloat during a lot of this COVID event. But where we have problems is when API is not being produced or not available. There are issues with finding API sources, or API is not shipped to the finished dosage manufacturer to make enough. Over time, we have a just-in-time system so that the inventory supplies in the supply chain may only last a month or 2 months at most before a disruption of that API means it dries up what we have in the middle to work with. Let me illustrate the other end though also. Certainly leadership is needed at the top of the country in terms of COVID-19 action and planning and policy. And there have been challenges and questions about that, but it's also needed at the end. There are some drugs that have been distributed to states. For example, remdesivir, when it first was approved with the EUA, certain supplies were sent to states, and state health departments then distributed that. I routinely meet with groups of pharmacy directors at major hospital systems in various states. And I heard stories from hospital directors, pharmacy directors, who said they had remdesivir allocated by their state. It showed up in their hospital's lab. Nobody in the lab knew what it was, why it arrived. It sat there for several days before they figured out that this was a drug and pharmacies should be managing this. So I think we need to look at it and make sure that our state planning reaches that last, you can run a marathon, but if you don't finish the last 200 yards, you don't finish the marathon. And that happened with remdesivir. And now I'm hearing the same thing with Lilly's monoclonal antibody that's being allocated at the state level to various entities, and long-term care facilities received an allocation. And I heard about some long-term care facilities that got shipments of monoclonal antibody. Well, most long-term care facilities don't have an in-house pharmacy. They have a pharmacy outside that provides the pharmacy services and the products. And long-term care facilities, for the most part, aren't prepared to administer monoclonal antibodies. They need special personnel to come in and administer that drug. So again, it's the last 200 yards wasn't planned for properly. We got the drug made and all the way out there to where the patient is, but the planning at the last 200 yards was not made properly.
Okay, we have Nathaniel. Did you have a point to make?
Yeah, I just wanted a personal anecdote and framed by a generic point, which is that one of the key ways that we are going to be able to do this better, and I should parenthetically say, Chris, I thank you for those kind words. I've just had the good fortune of spending the last couple of decades hanging out with engineers who see these things very clearly. It's risk pooling. It's risk pooling at the national level. It's risk pooling at the regional and local level. My anecdote is that while working in Lower Manhattan in the middle of February, I happened to see a hospital employee walking into the elevator with 4 boxes of N95 masks under their arms. I asked where they were going, and it was a request by someone in the hospital to get the hospital stocks. And I said, we're probably going to need more of those. And the person responded, I don't know where we're going to get them. All of our suppliers are out. So I immediately wrote to the hospital network person in charge of this and was reassured in mid-February that we had a warehouse. I think that's interesting for 2 reasons. One, it points to a lack of forecasting of the magnitude of what was ahead. where, you know, there were groups out there who could say one warehouse won't do it, but more it was that it was a system having a warehouse, where I think the only way that we can successfully get through these things, as we've seen with COVID, is through a system that is multi-institutional, multi-system, regional, national, in terms of having the resources restocked and then effectively managed so that they can be sent where they're needed.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from our committee. So we'll go to Alistair first and then to Mashid. So Alistair, go ahead.
Yes, my question is really to all three speakers. How do we identify drugs and other supplies that we should worry about in the future? In other words, how do we recognize the drugs that we might need for something that hasn't happened yet? You know, we wouldn't have predicted what we needed to treat COVID sitting around in November of last year. And the next problem may be equally different. So from your experience, how do we actually, how should we develop systems that would identify what we need or what we might need, or however you want to phrase that?
I'll just start off. Back in 2006, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality engaged my group at Weill Cornell, also Apt Associates and Griffin Scientific, to create a supply model for up to 13 different national security type scenarios. That's when I first met James. Hi, James, and actually was able to present to Dr. Vanderwagen. Hi, Greg.
I think we should thank Charlie.
You know, I estimated that we would need something like 2 billion gallons of Purell for a 1918 type COVID pandemic. That type of work is not typically funded by the federal government. It's very difficult to publish. It doesn't really lend well to an academic career. But I think that the answer that I would give you is that in peacetime, we need to engage in this very detailed type of modeling so that we can anticipate both the known things that we need and the unknown things that we need. I mean, we could put a little a placeholder for remdesivir or monoclonal antibodies, but we can get a sense of the scale of different types of events in a very straightforward fashion if we engage in the preemptive modeling of these events.
Yeah, I would agree with Nathaniel. I think there's a lot of modeling and exploring that can be done beforehand to predict, you know, for a variety of high consequence scenarios, which are the products that are going to be in critically short supply or critically needed. You know, but it ends up being a pretty good representation of the drugs and pharmaceutical products that we use for critical care and critical antibiotics. I think the other thing that's probably needs to be taken on with a deeper dive is the vulnerability in precursor and chemical components that go into manufacturing. And that's where a number of the supply chain dependencies actually lie. So it's one thing if, you know, the factory, the plant that, you know, makes the final small molecule antibiotic that you're using as your potential critical dependency is in the US. But if all of the precursor chemicals that they require to actually synthesize that product come from overseas, you haven't necessarily fixed your supply chain vulnerability. And, you know, the reality is, I think it's a good point. We can't necessarily predict what the next health security threat will be and what the next challenge will be. So you really need to look across the board at what are the most important critical drugs for managing acutely ill patients that are pretty consistent across the board. I mean, when it comes down to it, the things that we've needed to manage the COVID pandemic are pretty much the same things we've needed to manage, you know, H1N1 or another flu pandemic or an anthrax attack. It's all the same, you know, critical pharmaceutical list, and that could be something that's done just like the WHO has, their critical pharmaceutical list for healthcare delivery in developing countries. A similar critical pharmaceutical list could be developed for health security scenarios in the U.S.
I agree with both of the panelists that have spoken so far in that we can identify the drugs that will be in demand, drugs that are critical, drugs that can affect patient care dramatically if they're not available. The other thing, though, we need to be predicting is not only demand changes, but what things can create supply disruption, because a lot of the shortages we have are from supply disruption. Over the last decade, many of the drugs that have been in short supply have been sterile injectable products that are generically available. And the market has failed basically because we end up with 3 or 2 or only 1 manufacturer. And then if that manufacturer has a quality control problem or a recall or a plant shutdown, then the market is missing that drug in the marketplace, not because of a demand increase, but because the supply disappeared for various reasons. Something that has been highlighted to me in the COVID-19 era is another level of how supply can be disrupted. We saw several countries, including India and the United Kingdom, put export bans on products and think about how much of our drug we get from India right now in America. And they put 25 drugs on export ban. Now, fortunately, the US pushed back and got them to set those bans aside pretty quickly. But if we have countries that start putting export bans, particularly if China and India put export bans, we could find whole categories of drugs that are not available in the US, and we don't have the capacity to replace that supply in the short run, at least. And markets usually solve market failures in the long run, but patients have to be treated in the short run. And so I think we have a problem with market failures and with supply disruptions that is a different prediction than which drugs are critical. Once we know the critical drugs, then we have to be able to predict which ones might have supply disruptions and for what reasons.
Thank you I wanted to chime in as well. I appreciate hearing the perspective of all the ones who've been working together on this for many years. It's on our mind to the point around, there's been a real focus around finished materials, but really we can't, what we see in COVID, which got exacerbated in terms of visibility on this, is that we need to get down to the raw material level, because we can build, let's even say in any space, we can have multiple suppliers, but if they're relying on the same essential materials or API, we've got the same problem. And next thing we have an export ban or we have a public health emergency. This won't be our first and last time. So part of our not having a short memory is really getting down to that level to make sure not only that we have this information available and can act, that visibility we talked about, but that we're able to diversify that and really avoid that over-reliance. We've talked about that, and that makes sure that we're building at home, we're building wherever we can, but that's ensuring, like we said, that we are working in multiplicity and redundancy in that raw material. So I really just wanted to kind of underscore that. And as we think about kind of sustainability, because we can't plan for everything, but we can think about our overall capacity and minimize that risk by making sure we are having that visibility and then building in that diversification.
So if I can follow that up, Katera, and Steve, you mentioned that the market is failing, or that the market will eventually solve this problem. But why would it, right? I mean, if I'm a manufacturer of a drug, my job is to make a profit in the overall short term, not to be prepared for the 500-year disaster, right? For me to put in the capacity and so forth to be ready for an extreme event is not going to make money for my shareholders. So why would the market actually build this in? And so when you say we need to do this, who's we? How do we correct a market that doesn't have an economic incentive to build in resilience or robustness?
You want to go first? I'll start. Can you hear me? Yeah. So as part of, I mean, we all have a responsibility in this. And part of that is making sure that we're integrating value, quality, and sustainability in supply chain. I talked to you a lot about those partnerships. We can bring in multiple suppliers, but the quality has to be there and the commitment to supply. And it's not that it's all there, it's the ability to draw. If you have all your building blocks in a place that all other building blocks are, if something happens, and we saw it, it will happen, an export ban, or we've got populations, we have a shutdown, whatever that reason is, a recall, even short delays of that time can have significance. So we can talk about the market. We also have to talk about the overall capacity and ability to have resilience. And a lot of what we're seeing, and I think that's really healthy, and we want to see that, and we should incentivize that, by the way, is a lot of suppliers really willing to say, look, I'm going to build here, but I'm going to build in Mexico. I'm going to build in South America. I'm going to have my resources there for my populations in other places, but I'm going to make sure that I've got multiple places and the ability to shift as needed. And I think that's what you'll see because we can stockpile and we could put as much product as we want. But the truth is that stockpiling is only going to be a stopgap, right? To have all of that. It's just being ready to pivot and having that information. So from us, I think, but I'll also tell you that when we, in terms of the way that we've seen sustainability, we've got to see the quality there. That picture has to be there, or otherwise we're going to run into those issues and we're going to see a huge scenario. I look at, I hear this a lot from our healthcare providers. So the example of Christine, right? Where you saw a small space, you saw manufacturers, for whatever reason, their decision making, someone chooses, there's now been a re-entry into the market. This has a huge impact on folks. And so, by the work that you're doing to identify these critical medicines and other products, we're placing the visibility that these things matter. They matter and they're critical and we need to invest in them. And there's a lot of work that we can do with policymakers, but we've got to create, listen, I worked on the supplier side for over a decade. I know what it takes to bring product here as well. But we've got to invest. We've got to have positive incentives too. And I think that work's being done now, but we just need to think longer term and not forget this. Once we get a vaccine out and people start feeling better, long-term investment there. So sorry to take time from you, Doctor.
This is Steve Schondelmeyer. I also I described the market as failing and that in the long run it'll correct itself. And in a generic sense, that happens. I think the pharmaceuticals are a very unique market. We've established a pharmaceutical market that's based on monopolies when drugs first come on the marketplace with intellectual property. And even later on, when you're down to just 2 or 3 generics, they function like an oligopoly or even a monopoly. We have a marketplace that has extreme asymmetries of information where the people selling the drug know a lot more than the people buying the drug and the systems buying the drug. And I believe we have to establish a information system and a structure to understand the pharmaceutical market and the flow of products so that we can self-correct, we can correct the market when it is not working. And a big concern I have is that our current system of dealing with drug shortages is what I would call a fail and fix system. I applaud completely FDA and American Society of Health System Pharmacists for their drug shortage list, but those are lists of products that have already failed and we don't have them available in the market. Then we look for ways to fix those by making the drug available. I think we should have a system that has these supply chain maps that's identifying critical stages, even pre-API, API, and economic factors in the marketplace, and identifying predictive factors that could suggest we might have a failure and does something before the failure occurs. So I suggest we move from that fail and fix to a predict and prevent system in the marketplace so that we don't have to have 200 or 300 shortages active at any point in time in America. That's an unacceptable level of a shortage structure in the US marketplace. And we've got to work to clear that out of the system and use this predict and prevent process.
Whose job would it be to generate those supply chain maps in order to do the prediction?
We're trying to build that at Minnesota with an independent grant that we've gotten from a wealthy funder, but really the government should be doing that. We should have, there is no government agency that has such a supply chain map. And I don't fault FDA. FDA is doing what they've been charged by Congress to do, but that's not on the task list from Congress to FDA. And FDA may or may not be the right place to do that anyway. and this involves other federal agencies. I would remind the group that a drug like lorazepam was on the marketplace, had extreme shortages back in the early 2000s. And the issue ended up being that the generic manufacturer monopolized all the API sources, drove other generic companies out of the market, and raised the price dramatically. That's an antitrust failure. So the Federal Trade Commission needs to be involved in this. We need other players. And I'm not out to scare people off with various regulators, but we need all aspects: economic, quality control, as well as demand and supply and distribution in this picture. It's not just, no one player in the market can solve this problem alone.
Thank you. Masheed, you've been waiting patiently with a question.
Sure. So this is for all the speakers. Thank you so much for the great talks and input. So can you all talk about the role of resource sharing as a potential solution to bottlenecks in supply chain? And Nathaniel, I know that in your model, looks like you guys have accounted for potentially sending back, I guess, vaccines or reallocating vaccines. I forget what the wording was, but if you all can speak to that, that would be great.
Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a fade out of my internet, but very, hi Masheed, good to see you again. Very briefly, if you can hear me, can you all hear me? Don't know if anyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear.
No, you're good.
Okay, good.
You're good.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, so it's a critical issue. I just can say that this is I'm just gonna this is specifically what we're working on. This is a working paper that we're developing. Again, I'm sure that there are many engineering groups working on this, but we happen to have a team that has experience with both local and national modeling, and also direct frontline healthcare experience. And so what we're trying to do is create an argument backed up with good mathematics for why risk pooling, meaning sharing of resources, is essentially the only justifiable way to enter into an environment in which there is such dramatic uncertainty about both the demand and the supply, the continuous supply of a critical item like a vaccine. The answer is easy. Yes, you should risk pool. The justification for that involves a lot of mathematics, as I'm sure Professor Hopp would be quick to tell you. The science is just part of it. Obviously, everyone on this call has already identified the critical issue of getting that science first effectively communicated to the policymakers, and then getting the policymakers to work with industry in a way that makes sense in this country. Obviously, the UK, for example, with the NHS, has a completely different set of issues to deal with, but also avenues for success in this type of vaccine distribution, to take that one particular example, because they control the system in a way that, for example, the ASPR or CDC or other entities in the federal government do not. And so it's much more complex in our environment. I think that the role for science here is to make the case for risk pooling as utterly clear as possible. And that's what I'm working with my colleagues to try to do.
Thank you. Louis, you have a question?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, everyone, for your presentations. This is a question, I suppose, primarily for Dr. SCHONDELMEYER, but also for everybody else who has expertise in this area. There's been a lot of talk about raw materials, the part of the supply chain prior to the APIs. And while we've seen some data regarding the geography and level of concentration regarding APIs and finished pharmaceutical products. I don't know that we've seen the same for raw materials. And so my question for you is twofold. First of all, can you sort of give a very, general 10,000-foot characterization of the geography and level of concentration in that? And second, is there good data on those questions?
I'll start with the last one. No, there's not good data, and we're trying to build that database in our Resilient Drug Supply Project. And we need support of FDA and other government agencies to help build that database. So there's not good data, but as best we know, I look at what happens in other countries. What I know is India, who supplies a large share of the product in the US, maybe 40, 50% of the drugs that come to the US were made in a finished dosage form in India. They themselves say that 70% of the API used by Indian finished dosage form manufacturers comes from China. So that tells us that China is one center of API sourcing. Now, India is trying to recapture and reinvigorate their API industry. There is also some API sourcing, certainly out of Europe, particularly Eastern and Southern Europe. Italy, Austria, Croatia, some of the Eastern Bloc countries have production of API. A lot of the history of the API movement has been issues over labor force, lower labor costs, lower environmental standards, a lot of things related to general industrial and environmental protection and labor issues. And yes, that's reversible, but it takes time and it takes change in policies if we want to bring that back to the US or elsewhere. The other thing is we need to begin thinking about the key starting materials pre-API, much like we think about rare earth when we're trying to make computers and there are certain rare earths that have certain properties that are essential for the work we do in computers. And the rate limiting step is, where do you get the rare earth? There are some pharmaceuticals that have key starting materials of that nature that if we don't have those key starting materials and they're only coming from one or two places in the world, then that creates a bottleneck. So I think we need to look along the entire supply chain and look for where are the bottlenecks or the points of constraint or points of sort of single sources of supply that if something happened, either politically or weather-wise or of other types, if something happened, it would leave us without product.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in to say, I think what we're seeing, and again, data are difficult to come by, but the data that are out there seem to indicate that, much of the precursor ingredient materials for production are now coming from China. And, there are also, if you've read China RX or other writings, there's indications that this is not an accident, right? That this is a deliberate effort upon the part of China to corner the market on those ingredients, in part so that they can exert leverage. So markets are all manipulable, and they will respond to manipulation, and that can either be from an actor that's doing it for nefarious purposes, or at least for their own advantage, or it can be collectively for the purpose of doing good and allowing more open access to these ingredients. So this is something that, again, the Chinese see as a national security issue, and we have not. If we were to see this as a national security issue, we would work with industry to create incentives and also to create the potential opportunity for pre-competitive collaboration to exert innovation and additional capacity in production of these precursor ingredients. There's no reason why industry and government couldn't come together to create a common source for all of these ingredients that does not rely on foreign supply chain. Right now, there's no economic incentive for industry to get together and do that, but that could easily be supplied. And so, there's a similar phenomenon that happened in the semiconductor industry where, they were being outcompeted by Japan at the time in the 80s, and the government and the semiconductor manufacturers in the US got together and created Semitech, which was a nonprofit company that fostered research to further innovate semiconductor manufacturing in the US, and it was a great success. A similar approach could be done for pharmaceuticals to create, again, a commons where these companies can work together in a pre-competitive space to give them all access to low-cost, readily available ingredients that they all need. And then, that gives them a competitive advantage and also creates the national security buffer that we need to make sure that these ingredients are available.
Dr. Schondelmeyer, if you can come up with a couple of examples for the committee of particular pharmaceutical products that rely on a rare earth type, single source raw material, I think we'd be interested in knowing about that.
I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I can find you some examples. Also, I'd point out that antibiotics rely on fermentation, which is a specific process, and there is a concentration of the fermentation products in China already by intent and by design of the Chinese government, and that's why a lot of our antibiotics are sourced in China. Other therapeutic categories that are heavily sourced in China, other than antibiotics, are painkillers and epileptic medications, and to some degree, products like insulin and heparin. So those are examples of products that at least the process of making the API and things related to pre-API are heavily dominated in China. But I'll find you some examples of some earth starting materials that cause a problem as well.
Marta, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a quick question sort of on a related matter, Stephen. One ingredient, or I guess inactive ingredient that comes to mind that's very common across oral dose products is talc. And I'm wondering, just because it shows up, like if we were wiped out from the source of talc, it could have really big repercussions. And I don't know, where is it a concentrated market? Is it in sort of some of these high risk areas? Can the supply chain be flipped to not have to use talc? I just wonder, just given how common it is, how much of a vulnerable ingredient is that?
You raise a great point and a question. I don't know the details of talc. We certainly can investigate and give you some feedback on that. But that reminds me that it's not just the key starting materials for the API that make a difference. Sometimes it's the inert ingredient starting materials. And there's yet another thing that affects that, and that is the dosage form or the process. Making inhalers is a very constrained market, and there are very few manufacturers that can make inhaler products. And that leads to higher prices. It leads to shortages in demand, increase in demand, but shortages in product at times. And there are other unique dosage forms, like the sterile injectables create a problem. There are not as many manufacturers of sterile injectables. So there are a variety of dosage forms that also can be almost a rare earth type problem, that it's hard to make that dosage form. And there are only a few manufacturers of that particular dosage form. Oh, I would point out, well, independence is a problem, and we need to look at and figure out how to manage that better in the US. I would point out that if we manufactured our entire supply of drugs in the US, it doesn't solve the problem. Because if we put all of our manufacturing in one facility in the US, and that facility gets hit by a hurricane, think about Puerto Rico and the hurricane that knocked out the large volume parenteral products a few years back. Again, that was, Puerto Rico is American based. We had a production of large volume parenterals in Puerto Rico, but many hospitals are scrambling to get simple things like normal saline and D5W in large volume parenteral bags, because the plant in Puerto Rico was wiped out with a hurricane. So simply bringing production back to the US, but concentrating it in one place doesn't solve the problem. It just moves the problem.
If I could add to that point, when we talk about diversification and having that redundancy and multiplicity for a healthy marketplace, we've got to focus on this very issue. It's geographic diversity. It's at home, but it's also globally, because to the example raised around Puerto Rico or otherwise, we're creating risk when we create that concentration. We create risk because national, we're going to have natural events happen. We've seen them. These have been coupled on top of COVID. We also have situations where we have factories or shut down or recalls or otherwise. And so we've got to have that diversification. So really if there was something we would push for apart from that visibility is to really make sure that we're investing across. There are many global partners that are interested and investing in these places, but it's that over-reliance and having a visibility to that extent that we can help tackle this problem.
Okay, well, thank you. We're running up close to we're past our time, but you have given us so much interesting food for thought here that I didn't want to cut things off. But thank you so much, all of you on our panel today. This has been fascinating for us. Yes, virtual applause here from the committees, and thanks so much. We will continue on and do our level best to make a difference in this really, really important problem. So thank you all. Have a great day. Committee members, we're going to flip back to the closed site for a wrap up. So I'll see you on the other side.